Good morning, everyone. Welcome to learning event hosted by safeguarding boards in the Eastern region. This particular event is delivered by Herts Safeguarding Adults Board, and we're really pleased to have you here today. We've got Mike Ward from Alcohol Change UK, who will be delivering the topic of safeguarding vulnerable dependent drinkers. There will be some opportunities to ask questions, and Mike will facilitate answers, and he'll tell you about the format. Over to you, Mike.
Okay, thanks, Eva. It's really good to be here with everybody. What I'm going to do is to go through a presentation in which we look at this issue broadly of safeguarding vulnerable dependent drinkers, and that's going to draw on recent work that we've done at Alcohol Change UK, and also highlight forthcoming work that we're going to do in the next year or two, which will relate to this. You will get all the slides that you see on the screen, and as we work through the presentation, I will pause at points for question and answer. There are kind of 3 or 4 subsections in this, and after each of those subsections, I will pause to give you an opportunity to ask questions, and hopefully there will be time at the end for a Q&A as well. So without further ado, let me start moving forward. If there are any issues, then Eva will interrupt me and let me know. As some of you on this call will probably know, over the last couple of years, I have been working for Alcohol Change UK with Professor Michael Preston-Shute, who I'm sure is known to most of you as probably the leading British academic on safeguarding and mental capacity, and a man who's written a number of safeguarding adult reviews. We've been working together to develop guidance that will help professionals to use legal frameworks to better manage and protect chronic dependent drinkers. And I hope that many of you will already know that this document has now been published. It had a very long gestation period, I'm afraid, but it is now in its final form and is freely available on the Alcohol Change UK website. I'll probably get Eva to send it out with the slides, but it is freely available. And already we have had some quite stunning feedback about it. The comments we've received have exceeded our expectations, and this one here from a safeguarding social worker in Manchester, I have to say I found particularly moving, and the notion that we've actually prevented deaths with this document, and that it's changing the way people practice, is an incredibly powerful endorsement of what we've done, and more importantly, the need for what we've done. So as we go through today, I'm going to look at a number of themes. I'm going to think about the role that alcohol has in safeguarding. I'm going to talk about using and working with, understanding and working with complex and change-resistant dependent drinkers. Sorry, there should be another bullet point there. I'm going to talk about using key legal frameworks with them, and then I'm going to talk about the importance of cognitive impairment, which I think is an issue that has emerged very strongly from the work we've done on safeguarding. So let's just talk first about the role of alcohol in adult safeguarding. It's probably best if we start with real people in the real world, and a very powerful example of a real person is this woman here, Amy. Amy was the subject of a safeguarding adult review up in Lancashire, which was published about 3 years ago. Amy was a 50-year-old woman with a chronic alcohol problem who was found dead on a bare mattress in a sparsely furnished bedroom in a house that was otherwise strewn with litter and rubbish, rooms piled high with possessions, drinks containers strewn downstairs. By anybody's standards, that is an appalling way to end your life. And for us, I think our starting point is that we need to think about how we can work with people like Amy more effectively. and in particular, how we can use legal frameworks to protect her. But one of the reasons for focusing on the Amy case is that the Safeguarding Adults Review in that case highlighted another theme, which I think is particularly important. And that is the problem that some of the professionals who were working with her simply seemed to see that the way Amy was living was the way she wanted to live. It was, to use what I think is somewhat an infamous phrase now, her lifestyle choice. And I think if we are going to protect people like Amy, if we are going to use legal frameworks with people like Amy, we need to challenge that notion that she is choosing this lifestyle. Some of you will know that the real starting point for the work on the safeguarding guidance is a separate document that we loosely call the Blue Light Manual. This was published when we were still Alcohol Concern or Alcohol Change UK. And this document sets out tools, techniques, pathways, ideas for working with change-resistant drinkers. And again, it is freely available on the Alcohol Change UK website. And the basic message of that document is that we shouldn't write off people like Amy who don't want to change their drinking. There are things that we, the professionals, can do that will make a difference. However, we know that even if you've tried everything in the manual, even if you've used all the tools and techniques, there are still going to be clients who are not changing and who are so vulnerable or so risky that they require much more structured frameworks to manage their behaviour. And that is the group of clients we're focused on in the safeguarding guidance. And the place where we see these clients most acutely probably is in the safeguarding adult reviews. And 2.5 years ago, we published this document, Learning from Tragedies, which looked at the role of alcohol in safeguarding adult reviews. I won't send this document out as a handout, but it is again available on the Alcohol Change UK website. We looked at 41 reviews that were published in 2017. These were randomly chosen. Of those 41, 11 highlighted an adult who had an alcohol problem, and the adult being safeguarded had an alcohol problem, i.e. 25% of the cases were about people who were dependent on alcohol. Now, the reason I stress that figure is because last year, Michael Preston Shute, as probably all of you know, undertook his own much larger analysis of safeguarding adult reviews. He looked at 231 such cases. And surprisingly, in statistical terms at least, he found exactly the same rate of alcohol-related problems. 25% of these safeguarding adult reviews were about alcohol. And my hunch is that when the government enacted the Care Act back in 2014, there was no expectation that alcohol misuse would be so central, but it is. And anyone working in the safeguarding arena, anyone who could possibly make safeguarding concerns, needs to understand the role of alcohol in safeguarding. Probably the most powerful of the cases that was reviewed by Michael and also reviewed by us in Learning from Tragedies is the Angela Wrightson case. And I guess many of you will be familiar with this case. It was published as what is known as the Carol SAB from Teesside, but everyone knows who Carol is. She's had widespread media coverage, and I think it's fair to talk about her as Angela Wrightson. Now, if you don't know who Angela Wrightson was, and don't remember the name, you may well remember actually seeing this picture of Angela Wrightson on the main BBC Evening News, because this picture was on the main Evening News on at least 3 occasions between her murder in December 2014 and the publication of the SAR in June 2017. And the case was about this woman, Angela Wrightson, who was beaten to death by 2 teenage girls. Those girls were just 13 and 14. Both were in local authority care. And as you can imagine, the case caught the public imagination, and there has been ongoing media coverage ever since, including in 2019, a movie made about the last days of Angela Wrightson's life. But in all that media coverage, I think there is a danger that the focus is on the girls and that Angela Wrightson slips back into the shadows. But you can work out for yourself, even looking at that picture, that she was a very vulnerable woman who was known to her neighbours as Alcoholic Angie. And she had a huge history of alcohol problems, mental health problems, vulnerability, care and support needs. She had a huge impact on public services. In the last 3 years of her life, she had over 1,000 direct contacts with services like mental health, alcohol services, ambulance services, hospitals. 472 incidents reported about her to the police in her adult life. An astounding level of activity. But the truly astounding thing is probably the poverty of the response to her. Despite her huge impact, there was almost no multi-agency working around her. Despite her evident vulnerability, alcohol services in Hartlepool closed her case because, in their view, effectively, she was not motivated to change. And I think we owe it to people like Amy, like Angela, to move on from these kind of situations. We need to move away from just viewing these clients as choosing their lifestyle, as liking living in their own filth, as someone said to me about another client. The situation of these clients is much more complex than that. And professionals need a much better understanding of how they can support, how they can manage these very challenging clients. And what I'm going to do is to focus on those issues and kind of the learning from the safeguarding guidance. At that point, I'm just going to open it up and see if there are any questions that people want to ask. Is there anything anyone wants to ask at this point? Anything in the chat, Eva?
We have no questions in the chat at the moment.
Okay, that's fine. Let me go back onto the slides then. The first thing we need to do in thinking about working with this client group is to think about what we've called in the guidance the choice paradigm. This belief that these clients are choosing to live like this. We need to challenge that notion. People like Angela, people like Amy are not simply making unwise decisions. In reality, they face very real barriers to change and very real barriers to engagement with services. And if we're going to work with them effectively, we need to understand those barriers. And what I want to do is to highlight first a very specific set of barriers to change faced by these clients. People like Angela, people like Amy are not choosing to live like this. Rather, they are at the centre of an almost perfect storm of physiological things that are going on that make it harder and harder for them to change or to engage with services. And what I'm going to do is to highlight a number of these physical barriers that these clients face. Now, the first of these, I think, is very well understood by everyone on this call, and that is that they are depressed. Alcohol is a depressant of the central nervous system, and by drinking, they are increasing the likelihood that they are going of themselves to be depressed. And when we do studies of chronic dependent drinkers, something like 60 to 70% of them will report themselves to be depressed or to be low mood. And that's going to be a real barrier to people moving forward. But as I say, I think that's well understood. What is less well understood is the impact of alcohol-related brain damage and alcohol-related brain injury. And those two things are different. Now, when we think about alcohol and the brain, what we tend to talk about is Korsakoff syndrome, or Wernicke's-Korsakoff syndrome. And Korsakoff's is a heavy end dementia caused by long-term chronic drinking. It manifests itself a bit like Alzheimer's, with poor short-term memory, confusion of time and place, delusion. Even things like mobility problems can be associated with it. And as I say, when we think about alcohol and the brain, we tend to focus on Korsakoff's. But in an area of, say, 250,000 people, there might be no more than 4 or 5 new diagnoses of Korsakoff's in any one year. And what we need to understand is that those 4 or 5 diagnoses are just the tip of an iceberg of alcohol-related brain damage and alcohol-related brain injury. Let us focus first on the brain damage. This is the damage caused to the brain as a result of pouring alcohol down your throat. It's what happens to the brain once alcohol is in your system. And we know from the work of a guy, particularly a guy called Professor Ken Wilson, who's based up in the Wirral, we know that somewhere up to 40% of dependent drinkers will have signs of that alcohol-related brain damage. Not necessarily at the level of Korsakoff's, probably at a pre-Korsakoff's level, but nonetheless having an impact on people which may impair their ability to manage and motivate themselves. And when we look at these very chronic drinkers like Amy, like Angela, then the number is probably even higher. But that figure of 40% is dwarfed by the 50% of dependent drinkers who have alcohol-related brain injury, i.e. injury to the brain from the drinking lifestyle, from falling over and thumping their heads, from being hit by other people, from having fits. And if we quickly go back through the slides to this picture of Angela Wrightson, what you notice on her forehead is that there is some kind of mark or bruise or contusion, almost certainly the sign of a head injury. And as someone like Angela moves through her drinking career, that alcohol-related brain damage and that alcohol-related brain injury is going to build up and build up. And over time, she's going to become more and more like a punch-drunk boxer who's finding it harder and harder to organise herself, to motivate herself, and to engage with cognitive behavioural processes. And these 3 things alone explain a lot of the problems this client group have in moving forward. But they are not the only physical barriers. If you've got liver disease, and drinkers are 13 times more likely to have liver disease than the average person, then one of the early symptoms of that is tiredness, fatigue, low energy levels. Another demotivator. If you've got, again, liver disease, but also things like pancreatitis, UTIs, there can be confusion associated. This client group do not sleep well. They have really poor patterns of sleeping, and chronic poor sleep contributes to alcohol-related contributes to brain damage, not alcohol-related brain damage, to brain damage. And chronic poor sleep also makes you tired. So it's going to be a demotivator in the short term. They will also have poor nutrition. And that, as I will say later, contributes to the brain damage, but also makes you depressed. So again, a demotivator. And then we get to what I think we can legitimately call the real joker in the pack, the one we simply don't give enough attention to in this country, and particularly don't give enough attention to in adult services. And that is fetal alcohol damage. I think all of you will understand what fetal alcohol damage is, i.e. the damage to the unborn child by the mother's drinking during pregnancy. It will manifest itself with low birth weight, some physical abnormalities, but in particular from our point of view, mild to moderate learning disabilities and behaviour disorders. Now, the problem we have in Britain is that when we talk about fetal alcohol damage, what people tend to focus on is pregnant women, babies and children. And what we seem to ignore is the bleeding obvious fact that those children grow into adults. But of course they do. And they bring with them the legacy of those learning disabilities and those behaviour disorders. And that will be having an impact on people in adult services. And there are some quite stunning statistics about this. The leading British expert on fetal alcohol damage is a man called Dr. Raja Mukherjee, who is based down in Surrey. And Raja has estimated that in the adult prison system in Britain, up to 28% of prisoners may have fetal alcohol damage, which is a stunning statistic. And even if Raja is wrong by a factor of 2, and it's only half that, that is still a stunning statistic. And what we know even more robustly is that 30% of people with fetal alcohol damage go on to develop their own substance misuse problems. And those clients are going to be in adult services. They will be having difficulties engaging, motivating, and it will impact on things like their mental capacity. And we're not sufficiently recognising its impact. And already we've got 8 key physical barriers. And of course, on top of that, this client group are dependent on alcohol. The simple fear of withdrawals, the fits, the delusions, the nausea can be a physical barrier to change. So what I'm saying to you here is that people like Angela are not choosing this lifestyle. There are very real barriers to them moving forward. And unless professionals help clients to negotiate those barriers, then they will go nowhere. So we need to identify, understand these barriers and help people to negotiate them by building robust pathways forward for them. Without that, these clients are going to stay stuck. They are, of course, not the only barriers. There are all sorts of others. I met a guy up in the northeast of England who said to me, the reason I didn't go to alcohol services is because I thought I smelt. And I didn't want to sit in a small, centrally heated room with a really nice worker and reek the place out. And for all I know, that guy may have smelt. But we don't imagine these clients have those kind of sensitivities. But of course they do. They're people. There will be previous negative experience with services. They may be being set unrealistic targets. You've got to turn up sober. You've got to turn up on time. There may be fear of change, fear of failure, money problems, practical things like do they have a watch, a clock, a diary to know when their appointments are. There may be very real issues about peer pressure, family pressure, domestic abuse, coercion and control, cuckooing, and even at its simplest, physical inability to access services. And on top of those, there is the whole issue of stigma and prejudice. The quotation on the screen here is potentially controversial, but it comes from a very august journal. It comes from the Mental Health Law Review. And it's written by an academic, Professor Jill Craigie, from one of the London universities. And her article is about the difference in the way the Mental Capacity Act is used between people with anorexia and people with substance misuse problems. And she argues that stereotyping impacts on that difference in the way the act is used. She says, the mental picture of a person with anorexia is likely to be a well-mannered young woman. The mental picture associated with alcohol dependency is likely to be a disheveled older man. And she argues that those stereotypes influence judgments about blame, blameworthiness, and ultimately the use of the Mental Capacity Act. Now, as I say, you don't have to agree with that paragraph. But what I think is unarguable is that this client group do face real stigma and real prejudice, which will be yet another barrier to change. So again, it's very easy to view this group of drinkers as choosing the lifestyle, as liking to live in chaotic and dirty settings. But the situation is much more complex than that. These clients face very real barriers to moving forward, and unless we help them with those barriers, they are going to go nowhere. Okay, folks, that's an important bit of the course. I'm just going to come off the slides again and check whether there are any questions. Still nothing as far as I can see. Nope. Okay. Okay, what I'm going to do is to begin to talk about legal powers. And what I want to start by doing is to, in a sense, talk about something which in many ways is completely useless to you. I want to talk about what happens in other countries with this client group. I think there is a sense in Britain that using legal frameworks to contain the behaviour of chronic dependent drinkers is in some senses an infringement of their human rights. And I think that kind of thinking has influenced things like the Mental Health Act and how that was developed. What we need to recognise is that although that may be the view in this country, it is not necessarily the view in other countries. And indeed, it's not the view of the European Convention on Human Rights. Most of you will understand that what the convention is. It sets out a series of rights that you and I have, including in Article 5, the right to liberty. And it asserts that right, but then sets out a series of exceptions to that right. And the fifth exception to the right to liberty is the lawful detention of persons for the prevention of the spreading of infectious diseases, of persons of unsound mind, alcoholics, drug addicts, or vagrants. Now, the language there is the language of, I think, 1946. So it's not the language we'd use today. But what it does highlight is that the authors of the convention believed that there were circumstances under which it would be appropriate to curtail the freedoms of someone with an alcohol problem to protect them or to protect other people. But that kind of approach has not been enacted into British law for well over 100 years. However, other countries do take such an approach. And probably the single best example of this for us is the Drug and Alcohol Treatment Act from 2007 from New South Wales in Australia. This act allows a social worker to detain against their will a chronic dependent drinker or drug user, to take them to a designated unit where they can be detained for up to 28 days extendable by 2 further periods of 28 days, during which they can be detoxed, stabilized, and a treatment plan initiated. Now, if you're interested in this legislation, and I acknowledge there is no reason why you should be particularly, but if you are interested, there is a very good YouTube presentation about the New South Wales experience by this woman, Glenys Dorr, and the link will be there in the slides. But you can actually find it by just searching Glenys Dorr's name in YouTube. And she talks about how the Act works in practice. She talks about things like the criteria under which someone will be detained, i.e., they've got to be severely dependent and at risk of serious harm and likely to be benefiting from treatment but refusing, and no less restrictive treatment is now available. She also talks about the typical client who is detained. Now, this is a Drug and Alcohol Act, but the vast majority of detentions under the Act are for drinking. And the typical client is a 59-year-old bloke with a chronic alcohol problem. He's constantly calling out emergency services, he's threatening suicide, he's turning up at the emergency department, and he's living in squalor. All of us will be familiar with such clients. What we will not be familiar with is the outcomes achieved by the Australian legislation. At, I think, 6 months of 40 detained alcohol patients, 10% sadly had died, 25% had relapsed, but 60% were now abstinent or improved. If any alcohol service in England achieved those outcomes, they would be content. But what this highlights is not simply the effectiveness of this response. It highlights again that these clients are not choosing to live like this. The reality is that instead of choosing this lifestyle, they are actually stuck. And without a robust framework to help them move forward, they are going to stay stuck. Other countries have similar powers. In Sweden, they have a very specific act which actually obliges social workers to detain chronic dependent drinkers and drug users if they meet criteria. New Zealand enacted such powers in 2017 on the back of the Australian experience. In the States, I think 37 of the 50 states have such powers. And in places like Switzerland, France, Germany, Belgium, they have Mental Health Act type powers, which are flexible enough to embrace this client group. We, on the other hand, are struggling with the Care Act, the Mental Capacity Act, and the Mental Health Act. And they simply were not designed for this client group. But they're what we've got, and we need to work out how best we can use them with this client group. They won't be perfect for this client group because they weren't designed for them. But the whole point of our safeguarding guidance is to help people to use these powers in the English context. Okay, so what I'm going to do is move forward and talk very briefly about these 3 bits of legislation. I'll talk briefly about the Care Act and briefly about the Mental Health Act. I will talk at slightly greater length about the Mental Capacity Act, which I think in many ways is the most significant of these. In the guidance, we also mention 4 other areas of legislative power. The Human Rights Act from 1998, the 2014 antisocial behaviour powers, the alcohol treatment requirements, and the various bits of environmental health legislation, all of which can help with the management of this client group. But I'm not going to talk specifically about those today, but they are linked to in the guidance. I'm going to focus on these three. I mean, most of the people on this call probably owe their jobs to the 2014 Care Act, so it is something that I assume that all of you will be more than familiar with. I think there are a number of things we just need to say about it. First of all, we do need to highlight again that this Act does apply to dependent drinkers. And it's not me that says it, it's the Department of Health and Social Care say it. But last week, literally on Thursday last week in a London borough, someone argued with me very strongly that the Care Act didn't apply to dependent drinkers, which is just not the case. It does apply to dependent drinkers. And indeed, a formal diagnosis is not required to prove eligibility, but obviously care and support needs will be required. Our main focus in the guidance is not on Section 9 assessment, but Section 42 and the need to make inquiries and to establish whether action needs to be taken to safeguard people. And that paragraph, Section 42 on its own, would bring into the remit of the Care Act a significant number of dependent drinkers who are being abused or neglected by other people. But the big thing about the Care Act, obviously, is that neglect includes self-neglect. And I think, again, that is insufficiently recognised. But the reality is that the inclusion of self-neglect as part of neglect does mean that a very large number of chronic dependent drinkers with care and support needs may need to be safeguarded under the Care Act. And it's not me that says that, it's SCI, the Social Care Institute of Excellence, which acknowledges that self-neglect is an extreme lack of self-care and that it may be the result of issues such as addictions. However, what we notice in safeguarding adult reviews from other parts of the country, what I notice in safeguarding adult reviews that I'm writing, and what we see in practice as I talk to people around the country, is that there are still professionals, as I've said, who are pushing back against the notion that chronic, self-neglecting, dependent drinkers require safeguarding. But I think the guidance is quite clear that they do, and local authorities need to pursue their duty to safeguard some of these clients, and other professionals need to submit safeguarding concerns about these clients where appropriate. And we do need, in the same way, to make sure that safeguarding adult reviews are being undertaken on these clients. So I think in summary, the Care Act does apply to this client group. And I think it's fair to say that the Care Act is not the most powerful of acts. In fact, the 2014 Care Act is notably less powerful than the equivalent Welsh legislation, which was brought into force at roughly the same time. But I think the Care Act does provide a good starting point for this client group. The ability to raise safeguarding concerns about these clients is a way of focusing attention on a client group that has often been ignored in the past. And the duty to make inquiries and determine what action needs to be taken does provide a good framework for multi-agency working with these clients, which is probably the best approach to working with these clients. So, dependent drinkers who are vulnerable, abused or self-neglecting may require safeguarding by local authorities. Self-neglect should not be regarded as a lifestyle choice. Now, as I've said, I think the Care Act is a good starting point, but it's probably not our end point. And to reach the end point, we may well need to pass through the Mental Capacity Act. And again, this Act does not fit very well with this client group. Indeed, it's fairly clear that it wasn't designed with this client group in mind. nor indeed people with other repetitive compulsive behaviours like anorexia or hoarding behaviours. But again, it's what we've got, and we have to try and think about how we can use it. And in the guidance, Michael and I have not been able to offer easy answers about how you use this Mental Capacity Act. But what you've got is our best assessment of how it might apply. Now, I assume that all of you know what the Mental Capacity Act is, so I won't dwell on that. In thinking about the Act, I think there are two dynamics that we need to focus on. In the ideal world, the Mental Capacity Act is there to support the development of a care plan that is in someone's best interest. In reality, for many professionals, their experience of the Mental Capacity Act will actually be other professionals saying to them, no, we can't do anything about this client because she has capacity. And as we go through what I'm going to say about the Mental Capacity Act, we do need to think about both how it can be used in care planning, but also how we can challenge people who are wrongly asserting that someone has capacity. So at the heart of this is the question, do chronic dependent drinkers lack the capacity to make decisions about their care, their treatment, their living conditions? And at the centre of that is the two-part mental capacity test. And part one is okay for us because it asks, is there an impairment or disturbance of the mind? And the symptoms of alcohol or drug use qualify as an impairment. I think that sentence could probably be written better, but I think it's good enough for our purposes. The real challenge is stage two. Does the impairment mean the person is unable to make a specific decision? And a person is unable to make a decision if they can't understand information about the decision, or retain information, or use or weigh information, or communicate their decision. Now, there will be some chronic dependent drinkers who fail one or other or both of these first two criteria. These will largely be people with significant levels of cognitive damage, probably at the level of Korsakoff syndrome. And they may no longer be able to remember information. And with those individuals, mental capacity decisions, although not easy, may be relatively straightforward. But for people like Amy, people like Angela, the key issue is probably this one. Can they use information? Many of you from professional experience will know that dependent drinkers often understand that alcohol is screwing them up. They can remember that alcohol is screwing them up. They can tell you that alcohol is screwing them up. What they can't do is change their behaviour because of the compulsion associated with alcohol dependency. And I think that's the first framework for thinking about mental capacity with this client group. Can they use or weigh information despite the compulsion associated with alcohol dependency? Now, what would be good is if the code of practice specifically mentioned what I've just said. Sadly, it doesn't. It does give us a very close parallel. A person with anorexia may understand information about the consequences of not eating, but their compulsion not to eat might be too strong to ignore. And you don't have to be a barrister to translate that into alcohol. Someone who's dependent on alcohol may understand information about the consequences of drinking, but their compulsion to drink might be too strong to ignore. We also have legal judgments that bear on this. In particular, Croydon versus CD. CD was a 65-year-old bloke with a chronic alcohol problem, frequently falling, not caring for himself, home environment deteriorating, calling 999 all the time, turning up at the hospital. Very similar to the Australian example. And Croydon took this case to the courts to determine whether they were right that he lacked capacity to care for himself. And the judge agreed and ruled that CD did lack capacity in relation to decisions concerning his care, and made orders about actions to be taken in his best interest. However, I think the real challenge with mental capacity is people, clients, who get into cycles of capacity decisions. And what I'm thinking about as I talk about this bit is a guy whose care I was involved in up in the northeast of England called Neil. And Neil was a man who was quite literally found in bed by a social worker, covered in urine and feces. At that point, he was assessed as lacking capacity to care for himself. Neil went to hospital. He was detained in hospital under a DOLS. During that, he is detoxed. After the detox, he starts agitating to go home. His capacity is assessed, and at this point, he's assessed as having capacity to care for himself. He goes home, and the cycle starts again. And Neil went through that cycle 5 or 6 times in short order. Other clients have been through it 8, 10, 12 times. And we do need to think about how we can use the mental capacity framework more effectively with these situations. And I think, as many of you will know, what we're being pushed towards is executive capacity. I acknowledge this is not in the Act and not in the Code of Practice. But as a concept, it does have a good pedigree, drawing on work by NICE, endorsed by Sky, endorsed by academics like Michael Preston Shute and others, and featuring in things like the Angela Wrightson SAR. And in the Angela Wrightson SAR, it does say that an individual, when we're looking at individuals with addictions and thinking about their capacity, we should assess not just their ability to take a decision, but also their ability to execute that decision. Many of us will know, again, from professional experience, that often drinkers can talk the talk. What they can't do is walk the walk. They can tell you what they're going to do, but when they get home, they ain't going to do it. And that does raise questions about their mental capacity. With Neil, the first time he goes into hospital, we're probably going to have to accept the capacity decision. The second time, yeah, benefit of the doubt. But the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time, the 6th time, at some point we need to step back and say, this pattern does seem to suggest that this person doesn't really have capacity, even though he appears to have capacity. And into that thinking, we need to inject various other bits. The Code of Practice does help us with this. In chapter 4, paragraph 30, it talks about the importance of looking at past decisions that have not worked out when making our next capacity decision. We need to think about brain injury. As I said, 50% of dependent drinkers will have some form of brain injury. That will largely be frontal lobe injury, and that causes poor impulse control. And what that means is that at assessment, those clients can appear coherent, but out in the real world, they will not be able to put into effect things that they've said to you at assessment. You need to bear in mind kindling. This is the very specific problem that repeated detoxes, like we're driving Neil through, actually make people sicker. Over time, repeatedly detoxing someone means that each subsequent detox is likely to be worse, And over time, that worsening of the detoxes can mean that physical and cognitive damage increases as a result. And therefore, by pushing Neil through those series of detoxes, we are actually potentially making him sicker. And in the context of the Act, you have to ask, is that in the client's best interest? So the Mental Capacity Act does apply. It doesn't apply easily, but we can argue that the compulsion associated with addiction may override someone's ability to use information, implying a lack of capacity. Executive capacity should be considered. But above all, and particularly as the safeguarding manager working with Neil said to me, with this client group, mental capacity decisions need to be marathons, not sprints. We need to take time, multi-agency discussion, professional challenge to get to the right decision. And sometimes, as in Croydon, it will need to go to the courts. Finally, let me just mention the Mental Health Act. You will all know what the Mental Health Act is. What I want to focus on is the belief that it doesn't apply to people with alcohol and drug problems. Now, the reason people believe that is founded on this sentence. Dependence on alcohol or drugs is not considered to be a disorder or disability of the mind for the purposes of essentially the Act. And that does seem to put up a bit of a wall to using the Act with this client group. But a mental disorder under the Act is any disorder or disability of the mind, and that importantly includes mental and behavioural disorders caused by psychoactive substances. So as the Code of Practice says, you can't detain someone simply because they are dependent, but if they have mental disorders associated with their dependence, even if the mental disorder results from their alcohol and drug dependence, then you could use the legislation. That is not going to be easy because we have stripped this country of virtually all the inpatient alcohol and drug beds. So it's going to be hard to find somewhere to hold them under, say, Section 2 or ultimately Section 3. But it may be possible in mental health beds, may be possible in private sector beds, but it's going to be difficult. But nonetheless, I think we do need to assert that it is possible to detain someone under the Act if they have disordered mental functioning due to their chronic drinking. Okay, that's a big bit of the course done. I'm going to come off the slide so I can just see what's going on. I assume ever there are no questions still.
We have a question. It's just that people need to write them down.
Okay.
Sorry, it's a bit echoey. So I did reply to the person who has mentioned that they have a question to write the actual question down.
Okay. Does anybody want to ask anything, type a question now at this point? Please feel free to do so. I'll just have a drink of water for a second.
Yeah, perhaps it has been answered now in your presentation, Mike.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Thank you.
Okay. Right. So let me move on then. What I want to do in this section is briefly talk about care planning with this client group. And what we're talking about here is really making the Mental Capacity Act and the Care Act real things, because the Care Act and the Mental Capacity Act don't define what happens next with the client in the way that the Mental Health Act does. What those acts do is provide a framework that can support or require care planning. And therefore, if you're going to use those acts, then you do need to have some sense of what a good care pathway might look like for these client groups. I would say that the ideal pathway for the kind of clients that we are seeing coming through safeguarding adult reviews, and I'm writing a couple of safeguarding adult reviews at the moment where this is directly an issue, where you're looking directly at this pathway around detoxification and residential rehab. I think the ideal pathway would be a good inpatient alcohol detoxification, followed seamlessly by access to residential rehab. There is certainly no guarantee that this will work, but what I would highlight is at the moment, I think many of the local pathways for detox and res rehab are not fit for purpose. They are too slow and too cumbersome to work for this client group. Generally, for drinkers, I think it is right that we shouldn't rush people into rehab, that we should make sure that this is the right option for them. But for some of these very chronic drinkers, the best option may well be inpatient detox and res rehab, and that should be there. But for most of the work with this client group, it's going to be about working in the community with clients. It's going to be how we actually get them to engage, how we actually build a relationship with them. And for that, the best descriptor of a care plan in the community will be found in the Blue Light Project manual that I mentioned earlier. But what I'm going to do is just to pick out some edited highlights of what a good care plan might look like for this client group. Public Health England, now as many of you will know called OHID, rather unattractive acronym, Public Health England, as was, have asserted in clinical guidelines that they are preparing for alcohol that the best evidenced intervention for this client group is assertive outreach. It not only affects client change, but can also save public money. Any intervention with this client group is probably going to have to be built around an assertive outreach approach. That will take time, but is justifiable because these clients we're targeting are costing huge sums in public money. The other thing that Public Health England highlights as working in the clinical guidelines is multi-agency management. And as part of the Blue Light Project in various parts of the country, we have worked to set up multi-agency client management groups that focus on these complex clients, bringing together health, mental health, alcohol services, police, adult social care, probation, housing, and developing joint action plans about the most complex clients. And what Public Health England says in the guidelines is that the best approach is assertive outreach supported by a multi-agency management group. Multi-agency management with these clients works. And for example, in Sandwell, in 1 year, we saved £150,000 through good multi-agency management. In Northumberland, every month I chair a multi-agency group which has at its disposal 3 assertive outreach workers that we can target at clients. And I think PHE are telling us this is best practice. At the individual level, where an individual worker is working with an individual client, we have to focus on diet with these clients. Food matters. In particular, vitamin B1 deficiency matters because vitamin B1 deficiency is the main cause of alcohol-related brain damage. It's not the direct effects of alcohol on the brain. It is that alcohol depletes the body of thiamine, B1, and that causes brain damage. And therefore, we need to get B1 into people, ideally through a heavy-duty jab from the doctor called Pabrinex. If not that, heavy-duty pills from the doctor, multivitamins like you and I take, better diet, cornflakes, bread, Marmite, are rich in B1. But beyond that, these clients are all deprived of all sorts of vitamins and minerals. And the bottom line, and this is from the British Liver Trust, is that simply drinking without food increases the risk of liver damage. Simply drinking also without water increases the risk of liver damage. We need to get food and water into these clients. NICE tell us that family and carer involvement matters. Clearly, some family members are too abusive or too vulnerable to be involved in such processes, but a robust, reliable family member will help the process. We need to build structure into the client's day. We need workers who are trained in motivational interviewing. This approach, developed by these guys, Bill Miller and Steve Rolnick, argues that often when people talk to drinkers, they use approaches based on, for example, nagging, persuading, confronting, challenging, those kind of approaches. And what the evidence says is that doesn't work. Instead, you need to roll with resistance. Okay, I understand you don't see yourself as having an alcohol problem. That's fine. Let's find other ways of getting you better. Let's find other ways of improving your life. And MI gives workers techniques that they can use to have small, change-focused conversations with people on other things, but which over time can build back up to the big change, alcohol. And within that, although certainly not unique to it, is an emphasis on the importance of promoting self-belief. The thing that best predicts someone is going to change their drinking is that they believe they can change their drinking. And the best thing we can do to promote that is to make sure we demonstrate that we believe people can change. The Department of Health tells us that within a care plan for a substance misuser, you should have an engagement plan. What you're going to do to keep them engaged, and in particular, a discussion with the client about what is to be done if they disengage. Can I knock on your door? Ring your sister? We need to think not just about food, but also about cigarettes. These clients are very likely to smoke, and that matters because smoking is not just bad for drinkers in the way that it is bad for you and me. It is particularly bad for drinkers because it worsens a lot of the diseases they get. For example, heart disease, oral cancer, but specifically less well known, it also impacts on liver disease and potentially cognitive damage. So someone who is drinking and smoking is getting sicker quicker than someone who is simply drinking. And of course, nowadays, Public Health England have flagged up to us the importance of using e-cigs with this client group. We need to think about home safety. Have they got a smoke alarm fitted? Is it working? Is their money well managed? And ultimately, we need referral into local alcohol services. And for that, signposting is not enough. As I said earlier in the barriers exercise, for these clients, we need a warm, active, bridge building exercise to get them into services. And interestingly, NICE tell us something that works with this client group to get them into services, and that is bribery. We actually have academic evidence that bribery works. We've given gifts and vouchers to encourage people to engage with services, and it works. It's not always popular with the public, with the media, with commissioners. So it's hard to give kind of costly incentives, but things like clothing, food, travel costs, even complementary therapies can be incentives to engage. And that, folks, is a quick tour of what works with this complex client group. And all of that is enshrined in the Blue Light Manual. So I'm going to quickly move into the last bit of this course and then throw it open for any questions. I think the thing that we need to focus on now is cognitive impairment. For me, the Blue Light Project has been a journey, and we started off with this notion of change-resistant clients like Amy, like Angela. What do we do with those clients? And the Blue Light Manual highlighted a range of answers similar to the ones I've just set out to you. But as I said, that then brought us to the realization that some clients were going to need more robust frameworks, legal frameworks. And as we've begun to talk and work on this issue of legal frameworks, what has been highlighted is the need for a much better understanding of the levels of cognitive impairment in this clients group. And over the next year, we're going to launch, we've just launched another multi-partner project like the Safeguarding Project to improve understanding of cognitive impairment. We need to answer this question. How do specialist and non-alcohol specialist services screen and respond most effectively within the current world to cognitive impairment in drinkers? The world of drinking is a bit like a trip to the seaside. Some people never leave the beach, i.e., they never drink. A lot of people go out into the water and they paddle around, and they have a great time and they enjoy it. But some of those people will feel the tug of the tide and will realise that the sea is a dangerous place, in the same way that some people realise that drinking is a dangerous place, and turn round and sort it out. But some people at the seaside go out a long way and they get into real trouble, and some of them out there are drowning. And the question is, why do some people struggle so much to make a change? Why are some people drowning and some people are able to turn round and come back? And I think a large part of that is about cognitive impairment. And you can see that in this guy, Alan. Alan was a man that I wrote a Safeguarding Adult review about earlier this year. He died an appalling death. He was homeless, 53-year-old man, living in a garage at the time of his death, and he dropped a cigarette on himself in the garage and set himself on fire. He had a huge history of involvement with mental health services, alcohol services, and hospitals, things like that, adult social care, the police. He'd been involved with the criminal justice system since 585 arrests, impulsive suicidality. I can't remember the exact length of it now, but his chronology for 14 months ran to something well over 100 pages, which gives you a sense of the huge impact that he had on services. In just one 3-day period just before his death, he had this kind of pattern of service contact. Police called to an incident in a fast food restaurant. Ambulance called out to the same incident. Alan taken to hospital due to a head injury. Admitted to hospital for observation but self-discharging. Police bring him back, but then the hospital discharge him. There's conversations going on between the police and the probation service about Alan's residence and the potential that he's being exploited by other people. He goes to the substance misuse service intoxicated, won't leave, and the police are called. When the police are called, he leaves and he goes to a local church, threatening suicide, and the Mental Health Trust receive a call. Later on, he turns up unplanned at the substance misuse service. And behind that, in the same period, there are multi-agency meetings, conversations going on. What is interesting about Alan is the extent of his head injuries. In the last 14 months of his life, Alan had 15 head injuries and had prior to that at least one very serious traumatic brain injury as a result of jumping in front of a train. I think we're not necessarily recognizing the huge extent of cognitive impairment on this client group. But we do know that people are more likely to drink problematically because of traumatic brain injuries or other brain damage experienced, before birth. And that as drinking progresses, alcohol-related brain damage accumulates, making it harder to engage. Physical damage accumulates in the same way. The drinking lifestyle may generate other forms of cognitive impairment due to poor sleep. Hepatitis C can impact on cognitive functioning, strokes can. And what you see is people like Alan going into a downward spiral. They have a head injury because of their drinking. Because of the head injury, there's poor impulse control. Because of the poor impulse control, they're more likely to drink and they're more likely to have other head injuries. We know that up to 50% of adults with traumatic brain injury were drinking more than the safe levels of alcohol before injured. From America, we know that 50% of people in substance misuse services may have had a traumatic brain injury. People who then got an alcohol-related traumatic brain injury are 4 times more likely to have another brain injury. When we look at prisoners and probation clients, traumatic brain injuries in an American study suggested that 96% of those clients also had a substance misuse problem. People with brain injuries are statistically more likely to develop addictions. And we've talked about the link with fetal alcohol damage. And probably some of the best evidence comes from the prison system, where there is quite phenomenal rates of both alcohol and drug problems and head injuries. 50 to 80% of prisoners on parole in America have brain injuries. A study from the University of Exeter, 65% of people in British prisons may have some kind of brain injury. 80 to 90% of women in prison have head injuries as a result of domestic abuse. And that, although it's about prison, is also going to impact on substance misuse. And these clients are significantly cognitively affected. Poor attention, poor processing speed, poor working memory, poor initiation of projects, impulsivity, poor planning and organisation, poor mental flexibility, poor self-awareness. All of these are things which characterise people like Amy, like Angela, like Alan. And in the USA, they have specifically recommended that behavioural health professionals, like those in substance misuse services, should be screening for lifetime exposure to traumatic brain injury. Professionals in this country need to be able to identify and support dependent drinkers with cognitive impairment. And as a result, we are launching a new multi-partner project, like the original Blue Light project and like the Safeguarding project, where different partners, local authorities usually, but sometimes treatment services from around the country, each contribute a small sum of money. In the case of both the Safeguarding project and the Cognitive Impairment project, that is 4,500. And for that, they become involved in a process of workshops and ultimately training around cognitive impairment. And at the centre of it will be the development of national guidance on how to work most effectively with this client group. Okay, folks, I have covered everything I'm going to say there. I hope it's been helpful. I'm going to come off the slides so that people can now ask questions. Someone has said, why is this? But I don't know what you're asking, I'm afraid.
No, we have some other questions.
Okay, where are
Can
they?
you see them, Mike? So we've got a question from Damien. Can you tell me, are there any plans within the UK to review current legislation to be more inclusive of this client group?
Yeah, I can see them now, Eva, that's fine.
Okay.
The answer to that question is there are no plans in the UK. Sorry, there are no plans in England. In Wales, as a result of this guidance document, there is some work being just initiated to think about this. I wouldn't go any further than that, but we have been to meetings with the Welsh Government to think about this. I am doubtful whether in my working career, which clearly, you can tell from my age, is going to gradually draw to a close in the next few years, I am doubtful that I'm going to see a change to the legislation in my working career. I think in the very long term, there will be changes. It will largely, I think, be driven by the police, because the police are fed up to the back teeth with having to safeguard people. And they need a better framework to stop the police having to do all this stuff that they're doing. But what I'm more hopeful on is that we will get better guidance, and particularly the forthcoming Mental Capacity Act guidance. Maybe that will give us some pointers towards better management. But I think even if we can't get legislation, I think we can lobby for better guidance. And at the moment, Alcohol Change UK is beginning a process of lobbying the government around this. I can see Rachel has asked a question. Our commissioned alcohol outreach service in Hertfordshire have a policy of not working with service users who are not interested in reducing their alcohol intake. Is this a common policy in other parts of the UK? I think if you're talking about an assertive outreach service, that's a very unusual policy. All the other assertive outreach services that I know around the country, and I know most of them, are specifically there so that they can work with people who are not ready to change. Restricting to people who are ready to change isn't really appropriate for an outreach service. A lot of mainstream alcohol services, rather than outreach services, a lot of alcohol services do restrict their focus to clients who want to change. And again, I think that's not particularly acceptable, but I think it's more understandable. But alongside that approach, I think there does also need to be a specific response to the clients who won't change. And for example, I'm working with CGL in Newham in London, and they are developing twin pathways for clients who want to change, but also a pathway for clients who don't want to change. Whilst in training during university within our social work profession, there were no studies on drug and alcohol as the main concentration around the adults, child and the law, but not the wide understanding of alcohol addiction and the impact of this as a whole. My question is the limited knowledge in training and practice unless you're in the specific field. To be honest with you, I think that's a real issue. And what the tragedy of it is that in the 1980s, I was on a BASWA working group trying to improve alcohol training for social workers. And yet we still seem to be going around this same circle, that we don't have specific enough training, particularly when you think that 25% of safeguarding adult reviews are about drinkers. Social workers are going to need to be equipped with this. And I think, I don't know what we do, because this has been going on for a long time, but it does need to be addressed. Does anybody else want to ask a question or say anything? Okay. Any questions? Any comments people want to make? Someone's asked how best can you support an alcohol-dependent adult? What are the pathways? Well, I hope that to some extent I answered that in the section in the middle of the course after the legislation, where we talked about the importance of outreach, where we talked about multi-agency working, and where we talked about the very individualized techniques that work with this client group. Whether there are pathways in your local area for that is another matter. But I think we should be arguing that in each local authority, there ought to be a pathway for these complex change-resistant drinkers, and that there should be an investment of resources in this. And we do have, the positive messages that you probably heard on Monday or Tuesday, that there is a new drug strategy. And a lot of the stuff in there on drugs treatment is also applicable to alcohol. And there's going to be a big investment of money around this. So it may be that there is some hope that we can get some better services for this client group. Someone has said safeguarding teams sometimes tell you the adult has capacity. How best can you challenge that? Well, I think, again, that goes back to what I said in the section on the Mental Capacity Act that I wrote, and which is set out in the guidance document as well. We need to use things like the question, can this person use information despite the compulsion associated with dependency? Have they got executive capacity? Have they got cognitive impairment, which is getting in the way? And people need to think carefully about whether their actions are in the client's best interest, particularly if they're forcing people through regular detoxes. And those, for me, would be the best ways of challenging people who are saying this man's got capacity when you don't believe that to be the case. Are there any other questions or comments? Let me just look at things. Okay. Okay. I think I'll probably draw it to close there. Eva, I don't know if you want to say anything before we finish. It would be nice if people left some feedback in the chat function as you go. That would be really helpful. So I look forward to hearing from you in the chat function. Hope it's been useful, folk. Take care.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mike. And thank you everyone for attending today. I hope it was useful. And just to tell you that there is another event next month in this series, and this will be facilitated by Essex Board on 14th of January. And the topic will be delivered by Office of the Public Guardian. So if that is of interest, please look out for this event. It is available on Eventbrite to book. Thank you very much, everyone.